So in fact, I got the opportunity to work also with Dr. Devesh on this. I am not exactly from the biological medical background, as you can see, as he introduced me. I am a computer engineer, but I have a keen interest in uh, psychology. So I have a diploma in psychology as well. But my interdisciplinary interest, dragged me into all these important areas. And therefore, when I was trying to do this research, this particular paper, that's a cognitive framework for the study of the senses, it was an attempt from the interdisciplinary viewpoint. So I drew ideas from cognitive neuroscience, from psychology, from biology, from evolutionary, from developmental biology, and even from philosophy of the science. It is a synthetic approach based on scientific and philosophical perspectives. And Dr. Devesh helped me in giving his vital, important biological inputs wherever I needed. So together, we just worked it out. And it was just got published in December, last week of December. Yeah. Okay. So let me start with this. So far, we know that the hierarchy that we talk about when we talk about the senses, because senses are like the windows to the world we interact with, whether we are interacting with the outside world, external, or we even work with our inside world, our body. All our senses are around to help us give the vital inputs to make sense of how we're interacting with the world. So if you look at the history, there is a hierarchy that has been maintained. And so far, it has been dragged now also, that hierarchy. When I studied that, I found that it goes back to Aristotle. And even when you come to the modern context, both in philosophy as well as in science, we have a kind of hierarchy. Philosophy, it's more explicit. And in scientific domain, it's like implicit. In some areas, also explicit. And the hierarchy goes like this. Aristotle, he started with giving sight the first, the most important entry point, then followed by hearing, smell, touch, and taste. But now we can see the modern hierarchy got changed in 2015. Sandrock and et al., they further dig further into the research, and they formulated and explained that it has even got more weird, I would say, that the sight, audition are still there on the top, whereas the smell, you can see it has gone down. At the third, you'll find the touch and taste, and it has been relegated to, the last, the bottom one, that is smell. So this is the kind of hierarchy that we have challenged in the paper. The hierarchy talks very clearly that vision and audition, they're like the senses by which you get to know about things. They're the knowledge senses. They're the senses by which you can objectify things in the world. And the main reason is to find an object out there in the space, you must have its spatial location. You must see the object as something, bound, something rounded kind of thing. So that becomes much easier when you try to understand it through your vision. And therefore, this best suits as the most important objective senses. But when it comes to, sight and audition, when it comes to the other senses like touch, taste, smell, they're generally considered as something, very much like a subjective kind of thing, which talks about your body, yourself. Both in neuroscience and psychology, they're linked to appetite, emotions, homeostasis, something like that. So we have dealt on this topic to much bigger extent in the paper, and we have found out very interesting things, that it's not that these senses doesn't tell us anything about the objective world. Rather, it is opposite, that these are the senses on which we can more rely. Because these senses are centered around our biology more, because they are grouped around the chemistry and physics, what we call it the biophysics and the biochemistry of the body. So they inform us very immediately about our environment, which can be more reliable for us to understand and immediately react. That is, we call it the stimulus response mechanism is very rapid when it comes to the senses. But when we talk of the other two senses, that is the sight and audition, they may be very good in giving us very objective details, a very spatial, clear representation of the object out there. But they do not inform us about the immediacy or the immediate need of those objects for our biological needs. So I'll be unfolding all that. For example, you can see here that we very easily get illusioned by the vision. It is not just with us, it is in the biology of even other species. I've given one figure of a frog, you can see. It is very easy for someone to fool a frog because frog has a vision mechanism that anything that moves, like a black dot, if you make a clinical kind of setup where you allow a black dot to move around before the eyes of the frog, it will immediately, try to spike its tongue out and try to see that maybe it's a prey, whatever it is. So that is an illusion that the frog is having. Similarly, for human beings also, we can have so many different kinds of illusions. Here I have shown the fire illusion, like the bulb is, it is in its location, it is just blinking, but we can see that there is a kind of pattern. There is a movement in the bulb. So anyone can get illusion. Maybe the light is moving, but it is not moving. It is flashing at its own points, at its own location. But you can see that it's an illusion. We call it the fire illusion. So the point is that our eyes, if you start with the eyes, because that's how we have challenged the hierarchy. If you start with the eyes, you see that they are not cameras, actually. The organisms, they have evolved to resist kind of thing, a kind of a particular disorder that we call it as the entropy. It is a kind of noise that is inside the organism that the organism need to sort it out. Because when the data enter into the system, a living system or an organism, it is in a very raw format. And there are a lot of noise. So the organism has to reduce that noise. The reduction is known as reducing the entropy, the inside entropy, as we know in cognitive science. So instead of looking them as noise, the organism need to, extract out of that a particular kind of signal that is helpful, or we call it as the information. So there is a problem here that when you try to do that, any organism, when you try to do it, take for example, just we human beings, when you try to do that, we need to ask how we do it. So there comes cognition. That at the cognitive level, what happens is that the brain starts modeling the environment it is interacting with, whether that environment is the external environment or even your body, whatever it is. Because that's the only way it will try to get to know what's going on in its environment or around. So the only option is to model that particular landscape. So when it tries to model, what happens is that there is a data compression that takes place. You have to compress the data. You cannot allow all the data to float around and try to make sense out of it. That will be too much overwhelming thing for the organism. It will be too much of an energy that would be needed for such kind of computation. So the evolution, doesn't allow that. Even the organism, we know we don't do like that, because when you're trying to focus on something, you will miss out many other things. That is there. That is very natural. Why? Although we say it's very natural, but why it is happening like that? It's because of the cognition that is doing a kind of modeling. So in model, what happens? You take the data from the environment and then you compress it. And when you compress it, there is a trade-off. What is the trade-off? The trade-off is that you have to miss many of the micro details. And when you miss many of the micro details, naturally what you have modeled will definitely have some blind spots. And that leads to different kinds of illusions. And that we are talking about here. You can see the frog, or that of the human being, or anyone. And this is not just with this sense that you're talking here about the eyes, it is with all the five senses. Because all the five senses, whatever data comes in, the cognitive faculty within us starts modeling those data. It starts compressing, starts trying to find out the signal out of those noise. So it is important to understand that if we talk about the hierarchy and assume that objectivity means visual precision, then that's not actually a case when you talk about biology and cognition, because vision is a filter, it is not a mirror. So therefore, here the hierarchy actually collapses, because if the highest of the sense, what you talk about here as the vision, if that can make you, fooled, so that means the objective superiority of that particular hierarchy has already been collapsed. So this is how we started with the paper. So therefore, after challenging it like that, it is important to understand what we replace the whole thing with. So therefore, we started understanding through both the scientific and philosophical disciplines and all, as you know, I have already said that it's interdisciplinary work. So we came up with a framework, and this is what you can see in the screen. This framework is something which very clearly explains that we need to stop ranking the senses. So we need to start analyzing the interplay between the sensory inputs and the cognitive processing. That would be more important, because ultimately whatever information is coming through the senses, it has to pass through the cognitive faculty, which is doing the modeling part. So that is very important. So we came up with three important elements that we call it as the pillars or the silent features of this cognitive framework. The first one talks about the functional aspect. Then we have the objective aspect, and the other is the abstract aspect. In the functional aspect, very clearly, we try to explain that the role of cognition is to model, and when it models at a functional level. That means it models those data which are functionally useful for the living system. For example, in case of evolution, in case of life, what is useful for you to survive? What is useful for you to avoid the threats? What is useful for you to reproduce? Only those data get compressed and starts making sense for the organism. So that is a macro-functional kind of faculty that, that takes on for that particular kind of thing. And therefore, as I mentioned earlier, you will miss out many of the micro details. So this is what the first part is. I will go through it in more detail later on, but this is how it is in short. Now, the objective aspect, it talks about the external environment with which you come in touch with, what you come in touch with. What is that object you come in touch with? So there we have explained that all the senses, they are capable of giving us important information about the objective world. It's not that only the sight or the audition, that is the power of hearing, gives us any objective information. In fact, all the senses, they touches the objective world. We have redefined it to call it as the object world, which means the object means, as we discussed, it's a rounded thing, or it has a special location. You can find its special coordinates and all that. That's fine. But there is something else also. What is that? The object has its own material composition, how the object is made up of, what it is made up of. So that also need to be deciphered by our cognitive faculty. So which are those senses that helps us to do that? These are the senses which we have talked that they are subjective in nature, like the taste, then we have the smell, then we have the touch. These are the senses that actually comes to help us to know about the composition of that material. Take, for example, there's a chair. You may see the chair there before you objectively through your vision, but when you touch the chair through your tactile and through your haptic exploration, you may get to know, okay, it's made up of steel, or it's made up of wood, or made up of plastic, or whatever. You can't easily decipher that, understand that just by your vision, because you can be fooled. So the senses are acting, like an ecosystem together. All the senses have their very important unique features. They have their fundamental strengths as well as their weakness. Therefore, they have to come together, get combined, and they have to produce a kind of unified cognition, what we call it as a unified percept, or the Umwelt. Umwelt is a German term. So it means that the kind of experience you feel around you, your personal experience of the world. So that is how we feel. We don't feel separately, dislocated kind of data. It just gets compressed, it further gets compressed, and you get a unified perception, what you call it as a unified cognition. So this is what happens when we talk about the abstract aspect. In the abstract area, what happens is that this cognitive sense, which is started from the beginning, developing the model, it compresses it and starts converting into important meanings. So that we have termed it as cognitive sense. So one by one, I would go now. See, in the functional world, it's very clear. You can see that when you look at an apple, you don't see its molecular structure. You don't find its atoms. You only see that it's a rounded shape apple. It's red in color. So there is a filter. Our senses are filters. They tune to the macro scale. And we do not taste the molecules. We taste and we tag it into, okay, it's sweet, it's sour, whatever. So what is happening is that the senses are actually the best guess. They're making a guess. But they're making the guess based on what I discussed earlier. They're based on the models, the model that has already arrived, to the cognitive faculty. That is the only information that is available for the brain to make sense out of anything. So what it does is that it starts making the best guess. So the next question should be asked that how it makes guesses. So that is a very important thing. That simply by saying that the brain is modeling something is not enough. We also need to know what is this model. We talk about the model. What exactly is happening? What is the mechanism? What is it capturing? So this is very interesting that what we talk about model is nothing but the patterns. That is a certain kind of pattern or a regularity, a kind of invariance that the cognitive faculty has to capture. And that's what exactly is what we call it as the model. In model, it captures that invariance, that particular kind of pattern. Take, for example, I see the red apple, then it has to, throughout the temporal scale, it has to give me the information that it is red, it is red, it is red, it is not yellow, it is not yellow, it is red, it's not green, like that. It continues. That constancy has to be maintained. So we talked about the model, and now we talk that model is nothing but patterns. And in pattern also, the particular cognitive faculty, what we have termed as cognitive sense, is capturing two important fundamental things, even in patterns. And they are the constancy and the variation. Constancy, I was just talking about right now, about the redness or the red color. It has to maintain a constancy. Otherwise, you will not be able to make sense within the temporal frame. At the same time, it should also inform us about any variation that may happen in the environment. These two things are very important, and both are pattern-based. There is a constancy, you make sense out of it. Again, if some disturbance comes, you know what is the pattern, and immediately it should inform you, because in evolutionary kind of dynamics, when you talk about the predator-prey interactions, what happens is that they're all around in the jungle, and no one knows from where what will come, especially for the prey, or even for a predator. It needs to really scan its environment. The scanning of the environment is only possible if you have both the faculties in place. That is, you have a constancy, you will be able to exactly locate that particular prey, suppose if you're a predator, and if something else happens, you should be able to maintain your constancy, ignoring that, or if it needs an attention, you should be shifting your attention to. So these are the very fundamental things. I'm talking from the very fundamental, from the very fundamental stages. So right now we have model, we have patterns, and then in the pattern, we have these two things. One is the constancy and another is variation. So this is how the functional aspect is being governed. by the cognitive faculty. And as you get to the objective part, as you know, as I've already taught, that it is the object is not just an object in itself standing there with a spatial location around it and, you know, completely closed seat, but it is something which is made up of some stuff. So the countable spatials define all these things are being captured by the vision and audition, but the stuff or the material composition of the chemical properties, they are the domain of the smell, taste, and touch. You can't understand them so clearly by vision and audition. You need these senses to know about their material composition. So therefore, it's very important to see that how this hierarchy is working. You see the old hierarchy, it prioritizes objects, but our new framework, it validates the stuff. And therefore, smell and taste, which are generally seen as something very subjective, they're not subjective, they are superior senses, but in their own domain. And what is that domain? The domain is a material composition. That is very important. And then we have the third pillar, or the third silent feature of this cognitive framework. That is the cognitive sense. This cognitive sense, this word we have introduced in our framework, and it's not just a kind of heuristic level, just to make things simpler and easier to talk about. No, we have proposed it in a way that it is a kind of architecture. It's not a particular faculty in the brain. You can find that, okay, this is where the cognitive sense is. It's not exactly a kind of, localized brain region. No. From the studies, we understand that the brain doesn't work like that. There is lots of, growing evidence in neuroscience that how the brain operates. It is a distributed network. Even the general intelligence, the small g, it doesn't work that locally. It has to coordinate with all different kinds of brain regions. I was just recently reading an article that was published in Nature. Very nicely, the researchers have pointed this out. The other day I was finding that different brain regions, they coordinate and create a kind of pattern, what they call it as the signature, for a particular cognitive task or a particular cognitive function, to execute. So a cognitive function or a cognitive task is not just something that is locally being executed most of the time. It needs a coordination of different brain regions. They together coordinate and they form a kind of module. And when the module is executed, you can know the behavior. That is the corresponding cognitive function or the cognitive task, whatever it is. So therefore, when we try to introduce this word cognitive sense, we are very careful how we are placing it. So we have placed it that it is something that is a kind of cognitive architecture and which is very distributed. And it involves all different kinds of brain regions that are necessarily required for creating this kind of modeling. The sole purpose of this cognitive sense, as we have used here the word sense, it should make sense. It should be able to create certain information by which the organism can make sense of its environment. And that is a very important, complicated, coordinated task, especially when it comes to human cognition. But that cognitive architecture is something that I'll be talking about a little later. It is there present across species. It is not something exceptional in the human being. It is a kind of spectrum. In the evolutionary history, if you can trace, we can see how it is at a very minimal level. I'll discuss that in a bit detail, but just here. And gradually, it gets to human level. And when it gets to human level, it becomes really very complex. Way complex to the extent that this cognitive sense can produce kind of abstract information that can lead to pathology. So this is what the topic is here, that the raw sensory data, they're not enough. The brain creates new information through high-level processing. And because of that, we are aware of all the math, language, art, they all emerge actually from this cognitive sense. Without cognitive sense, it's very difficult to do any kind of abstract symbolic processing, symbolic reasoning, and all kind of stuff. So it's a whole architecture that works together. It allows us to plan, to predict, and abstract beyond perception. You can imagine, in human being, we can imagine about something which is counterfactual. You can imagine a world that doesn't exist, something kind of, Alice in the Wonderland, something. You can do many sorts of things which falls in the category of non-veridical abstraction, which just doesn't exist at all in reality in the world, but you can do that. So what is triggering that? What is that engine that is working to create that kind of thing? That's what we're talking about here, is the cognitive sense. It's a particular kind of cognitive architecture. Why we have put it like that? Because that's where we will be able to easily study it also, the way the nature has developed it across species. So therefore, after speaking about all these three layers, now if you look back and try to reevaluate, we will be able to reevaluate. Therefore, let's try to reevaluate first the higher senses. When you talk about the vision and audition, what we have done is that after challenging the hierarchy, we have created a kind of category. We have placed the senses into two categories. The first two, the vision and audition, we have placed it as digital senses. It is anyway known as digital senses, though we have not disturbed the terminology. It perfectly suits our cognitive framework. But the other senses, taste, touch, and smell, we have given it a specific name. We call it the vital senses, to distinguish it from the first two. In current terminology, current medical terminology, all the five senses are considered vital, but that's not exactly the case when you dissect it further. The last three senses that you're talking here, the taste, smell, and touch, they are very much connected to the biophysics and biochemistry, and therefore to the biology, and they're very vital. And therefore, they have a very rapid response, stimulus response mechanism. They will immediately inform you. They're very hedonic in nature. Immediately, the reactions are very, very fine-tuned and very quick, because that is required. Our body is made up of biology. And biology means you have chemistry, you have physics, both to it. And therefore, the senses need to inform us about that particular domain, which the vision and audition lacks. Vision and audition will take time to understand what is happening out there in the environment. So that is the situation there. They are, designed. Take, for example, you see if a child may see a fire or a snake, a poisonous snake, but it will take the child maybe some years when he become a little bit older, grow a little bit, then you have to understand, okay, this is a snake, it's not good for me. Otherwise, the child will immediately run to play with that snake, because you don't have that semantic understanding about what you are seeing. But while running towards that snake, if the child falls off, it gets hot, the child will immediately react, because that's something that is affecting your biophysics, something that is affecting your biochemistry. So the senses are tuned like that. So you can't say something is higher, something is superior. It's not like that. So we termed it specifically, we categorized it like this, that, okay, these are the digital senses. They don't have that, quick stimulus response, speed that is a little bit slow. But when it comes to the vital senses, okay, yes, they are. They have a rapid response mechanism. So that's how we have identified, and it is also, when it comes to human cognition, we see that there is a lot to do with the neuroanatomy. Why it is like that? And it has to do with the neuroanatomy, and we have discussed that in much detail in the paper. I won't go into the detail. I'll just say that especially the vision and the audition, the information, the neural pathways, it passes through the thalamus into the higher level of processing of regions of the brain, like you have the prefrontal cortex, you have the parietal, you have the temporal lobes, all that. That is very responsible for varieties of abstract reasons and abstract things. It'll take time to process and make sense out of those signals. So that's how there is a delay. There is a delay, but it has a reward also. What is the reward? You get a lot of flexibility to model things around different abstract kind of reasoning or possibilities. So there is a neuroanatomy. It goes through that, because of which it is possible to model more than one kind of possibilities. But that's not exactly the case when it comes to taste, or when it comes to touch. Though they pass through, the thalamus, but there is a problem with them. They don't reach up much. And in the case of smell, it completely bypasses in many of the cases, like especially when you talk of the orthogonal, or orthonasal olfaction. It completely bypasses, goes through the peripheral cortex, and then further it goes finally into the directly orbitofrontal cortex, that is OFC. So there is a problem. That there is a problem in the anatomy. We may see that there is a problem, but actually it's not a problem. It's a kind of trade-off, a kind of balancing mechanism that the nature has designed, that we are equipped with both the possibilities. You know something out there from a distance, you can plan, and you also know something out right here and now, which needs your immediate attention. That is a vital senses. So together, we start making sense of the world. So this is what the idea is when you talk about the reevaluating of the higher senses. So the superiority is not exactly it is not inherent. It is because of particular kind of neuroanatomy they go through. For example, if you have an eagle also have very wonderful eyes, much more better than ours. But it lacks that kind of neuroanatomy. So finally, the kind of output that you get is not that much abstract. The eagle starts looking only towards the food, and it pounds upon the food. So there is a veridicality in it. But in human beings, those particular information that gets abstracted through these senses, the vision and audition, can take you to non-veridical realms, as we were discussing earlier, even to state of pathology. So this is the situation when it comes to understand and try to reevaluate the vision and audition. And I will explain that in terms of smell, taste, and touch. Yes, they are no more lower senses. As we are discussing, they're actually the guardians of the body. They ground the organism in the biological basis of life. Resist abstraction. They need to resist abstraction because abstraction takes time to understand. So they need to resist. So you cannot visualize, for example, you cannot visualize a smell as easily as a shape. You cannot. Anyone can try also right now here, imagining. So you can see that also for case of the smell. Even the smell, we know that it tracks the pattern with a constancy, and it is able to connect to a particular kind of stuff which is composed of many volatile compounds. Take, for example, 800 volatile compounds are there in the coffee, but we see it, we smell it as a single whole. So even you can see that the nose is able to track this kind of constancy. And if there is a variation, it is able to do that. So it is not that only the vision is able to do that. No, we can see that even for the case of the smell. And this is the whole ecosystem, therefore, we came out with. This is there in the paper also, that the organisms, cognitive and perceptual systems, they work together. The cognitive system, it generates abstraction, whereas the perceptual system, actually, it operates at a unimodal, multimodal, and cross-modal channels. And finally, what happens is that you get a grounded pattern-based objecthood that is necessary for the biological system. And this has an evolutionary logic. Why it has happened like that, especially when you talk of human being, why human being is able to do lots of abstraction. So when we are studying, we found that there is a kind of law that's known as the asymmetric law, or the law of increasing functional information. That was very recently, I think in 2023, it was published by the researchers in PNAS. So it talks that as you go ahead with the organism's hierarchy, the functional information must increase, or the functional information, if increases, only those species will be allowed. So now we can connect that for the lower species. Take, for example, you have a bacteria, or like we saw that, a frog, like that. So this is not the case, because they're not able to abstract much. But when you talk of human being able to abstract a lot, because that increases their systemic functional information more and more. Therefore, they're able to do that. They can plan for the future. It may be counterfactual, but still they can plan all that. So what happens is that when these distal senses, they combine with the cognitive sense, although we can plan, we can gather a lot of information, but there is a problem of immediate physical risk. it can abstract you out of the real, immediate environmental, physical realm. So there is a trade-off here also. And therefore, the old view can be replaced with a new, where the vision and audition, they can be seen as distilled. The smell, taste, and touch can be seen as vital. And the goal is more towards objective, not towards accurate representation. We will never be going to have an accurate representation of anything because the data is getting compressed. You are going to miss out definitely some details at some level. So that is not possible. So here I was talking about earlier also that it is a spectrum in single cell bacteria to frog to social bonding with primates. I mean, in children, they do certain kinds of abstraction. But when you become adult, you can do lots of abstractions. That is the problem. And also, that is the reward. The reward is that you can create maths, you can create science, you can create arts, you can create poetry. But the problem is that it can take you away from the reality as well. So that is the situation. And this is what we have presented it in the form of a flowchart. This is a divergence. Now, let me come to the other part since we're running short of time. So I will speak a little bit on its translation value. Especially, I will take on the topic of the schizophrenia. Although we are working on many other mental disorders, but this is the one we are working on. So schizophrenia, as you know, is a case where it was first coined by Eugen Bleuler as a concept in 1911. And it's talked about it as a kind of fragmentation in the different psychic functions, like the volition, like the emotion, like the thought. So this sort of fragmentation are being taken care of through different kinds of therapies. One of them is metacognitive therapy, and you have the insight and reflection therapy, MERT. So all these are there in place, but they don't exactly have a mechanistic framework to deal with how to understand what is going wrong. So this is where we found that we have a potential. We're working on this to develop a full predictive, mathematically and computationally rigorous model dealing with this particular disorder. So this is where our framework may help, that we'll be able to connect and explain exactly what is going wrong because we have a framework. That is the point. So if you look at, still it is in a developmental phase, but it's good enough to explain the basic idea of what is happening is that through our framework, we can easily explain that if there is an embodiment loss, then it's due to the vital senses getting disrupted. If there is a disorganized thinking, it is due to the cognitive sense that gets overwhelmed. If there is a blunted affect, it's because of the emotional integration failure. And if there is a social withdrawal, there's an intersubjective loop that is broken. The whole ecosystem we need to really look at. Similarly, there is one more theory also that is around, especially that is used in psychiatry for dealing with schizophrenia. That is known as the pattern theory of the cells, PTS, that is developed by Gallagher. It also talks about which part of yourself basically gets fragmented. Like you have the embodied self, you have the narrative, you have the affective, you have the social. So what gets disrupted, but it doesn't talk exactly about how and why it disrupts. So this is where our framework is going to help, because if you know exactly the mechanism, then it becomes much easier for any kind of targeted intervention you can have. So this is what these two areas we can complement. But even if you don't use those particular therapies that are in place, our cognitive framework can help in dealing with the situation directly in a standalone way also. That's what we are developing. And the other part is that when you talk about bringing such kind of models that we create in the lab to the clinic, to the people, many times it fails. It fails because of a fundamental reason. The reason is that many times we focus on the local areas. Take, for example, there is a kind of cognitive disorder. You look at all the components, you break all the components, then you look at the local mechanism, and then you start intervening in that particular area. But it's not that all of such cases are resolved like that. So there are lots of failures. Many times it is possible that we are looking at a wrong place in a wrong way. The layer that has got disrupted is something else. It is some kind of systemic imbalance that has happened, some kind of ecosystem that has got disturbed. For example, in schizophrenia, we can very clearly say that the problem is not with the brain. There is no such problem when it gets to computational, deficit or any kind of chemical problem that has happened. What has happened is that the sensory cognitive loop that has got disturbed. So it is important, therefore, that when we talk about different kinds of biomarkers, the biomarkers should not be restricted to, local, very static kind of biomarkers. But it is important that we change the diagnostic pipeline. So this framework talks about that. So we can change the diagnostic pipeline that, okay, fine, you have all those things, but you can add on more, talking about the systemic kind of biomarkers, like the variability, dynamics, the kind of regulatory range that is required for the whole system to operate. For example, I got to know that HRV, that's the heart rate variability, it outperforms the inflammatory biomarkers when it comes to ICU prognosis. So we have to take everything together. So then it becomes much more robust. So that is what the potential we can see through our framework. It becomes much easier to translate it, not just in the lab, but it should go to the clinic, go to the lives of the people, and we can have a better assessment, better diagnosis. So that is very important. So I will be concluding here that ultimately cognition is nothing but it's a kind of mapping that we do through models to patterns. And the vital senses, they keep us alive in the moment, whereas the digital senses, they allow us to plan for the future. Together, they ensure, direct contact with the world for balance, without exception, but always there will be a trade-off. We will miss out the details many times to get something else. So that trade-off, that balance will always be there in the nature, in our life. We have many open questions, research questions also, like what is cognition about and all that we are still working on. And it's not so easy to define cognition. So these things are going on, and how does cognition interact with the biology? These are various open questions. Later on, we can take on if time allows.
Actually, brain and senses is a very deep topic, and in Germany, they have actually formed a multidisciplinary team to basically study brain and senses. And a particular medical curriculum has been developed, basically comprising of all the clinical branches to study brain and senses, because nobody is able to correctly understand. Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful talk. And maybe some other time we can have a more session.
So I was speaking also on behalf of Quest Research Center. So I take the opportunity to also request all the dignitaries, personalities who are attending this to join us. It's a not-for-profit initiative they have taken. Our organization, from the organization point of view, it's just very young, but our spirits, our morals are very high. And we believe we work on simple philosophy that if you have a real grip over the fundamentals of life, then you have a better possibility to translate it right from the lab to the clinic to the lives of the people for health and well-being. So that is what we believe in, and we are trying like that. So I request that also, taking this opportunity, that if you can join us also for this important service that we're trying to do and extend for humanity. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks.